There are moments when heaven seems silent and God feels distant. It was in that cutting silence that Watchman Nee, isolated for years in a damp cell, discovered the secret that nearly everyone ignores: the hidden power of silence. When the voices of the world fade away and only the echo of one's own soul remains, something begins to be born, an invisible communion, impossible to be manufactured by human effort. Silence was not the absence of faith. It was the fertile ground where the Spirit whispered what the noise of the world would never allow to be heard. Nee understood that most people flee from silence because it reveals who they truly are. In it, masks fall, noises dissipate, and the soul is confronted with the most feared sound, the sound of its own truth. The prisoner, without applause, without a pulpit, and without freedom, found a freedom that no man can give, the freedom to hear God's voice in the midst of nothing. And this is the revelation you are about to discover: why silence, which so many avoid, is exactly the key that opens the deepest doors of spiritual life. Watchman Nee did not seek out silence. Silence found him when everything was taken away. At 43 years old, he was imprisoned, separated from his books, from his congregation, from every comfort a spiritual man could desire. But there, in that forced solitude, something extraordinary began. He began to hear. Not with his ears, but with the deepest part of his being, that part which few can access because they are always speaking, always acting, always filling the void with noise. Nee realized that throughout his entire previous life, even as an influential preacher, there had been a constant murmur that kept him away from the most important voice of all. Prison became his deepest seminary. While the outside world assumed he was lost, trapped, useless, Nee was experiencing the highest spiritual education, the death of ego through the death of the word. He understood that most preachers, pastors, and spiritual leaders commit the same fundamental error. They speak far too much about God because they rarely silence themselves to listen to Him. Silence is not a void to be filled. It is a space where divine presence becomes impossible to ignore. Everything he had preached, everything he had taught in 2 decades of ministry, now he was living at a completely different dimension, far more real, far more transformative. Nee discovered that silence reveals the truth that words always tried to disguise. When you are alone, truly alone, without audience, without approval, without the validation that comes from doing something important, who are you actually? The prisoner understood that most people never ask themselves this question because they fear the answer. They construct entire identities from external noise: what they do, what they possess, what others say about them. But silence strips you of all of that. It places you before a mirror that does not lie. And that is precisely why so many people flee from this mirror, filling every moment with sound, with occupation, with anything that avoids confrontation with their own truth. Nee's experience transcended physical imprisonment. He realized that most human beings live in a mental prison far more restrictive, the prison of constant thought, the necessity of justification, slavery to the judgment of others. The concrete cell and iron bars, ironically, liberated him from this invisible and infinitely more powerful prison. While his guards believed they had captured him, Nee was experiencing a type of freedom that no key could grant or deny. This is an inversion of what the world understands about imprisonment and freedom. What Nee discovered in those isolated years is a secret that remains dormant in most modern souls. You spend your entire life fleeing from yourself through noise, through activity, through external validation, and when you are finally alone, you feel terrified. But it is precisely in this terror that the most extraordinary opportunity of your spiritual existence dwells. Nee understood that silence was not a punishment, it was a gift. And as you penetrate more deeply into this truth, you will begin to understand why 95% of people ignore it completely. There is a crucial difference between being alone and being in genuine silence. Watchman Nee had much time alone in that cell, but it took time for him to reach true silence, not simply the absence of external noise, but the cessation of internal dialogue, that constant conversation the mind maintains with itself. That conversation is where most people spend their entire lives. They think about worries, about hurts, about desires, about regrets, about expectations, about everything except what actually matters. True silence only arrives when you can create space between yourself and your own thoughts, and that is terribly difficult. Nee described this state as a rest of the soul, and it is not simply a psychological experience or meditation technique. It is an encounter with a reality that exists beyond mental constructs. When the mind finally rests, when the constant chatter finally ceases, something else begins to inhabit that space. You begin to perceive things that were there all along, but which you could not hear because you were too busy speaking. And here is the crucial point, that silence reveals things about yourself that you could have spent your entire life avoiding. Patterns you do not want to see, desires you do not want to acknowledge, hurts you do not want to feel. Most people in the modern Western world flee from this violently. They feel an inexplicable anxiety when entering prolonged silence, and for a very precise reason, because silence forces them to confront their own existence without the distractions that normally keep that reality at a distance. That is why people fill every empty moment with music, podcasts, social media, anything to avoid being truly present with themselves. But Nee, trapped in that cell with no escape, had no choice. And it was in this lack of choice that he found the most important choice, the choice to stop struggling against what is happening within him. When you stop resisting silence and what it reveals, something extraordinary begins to happen. Nee describes this as a death of sorts, the death of the defensive self, of the self that is always trying to appear better, more spiritual, more evolved than it really is. That death is simultaneously terrifying and liberating. You realize how many lies you have constructed about yourself, how many false identities you have carried. But when those lies begin to dissolve in silence, what remains is something far more real and far more precious. An authenticity that no person could buy or achieve through effort. Watchman Nee came to understand that this silent confrontation with the soul is precisely what the human ego desperately tries to avoid everywhere. Because if you really saw who you are, without the masks, without the justifications, without the rationalizations, you would have to change. It would be impossible to remain as you are, and change frightens. It is far easier to pay attention to the news, to social media, to other people's lives, to anything that keeps your own mirror covered. But silence, if you allow it, removes that veil, and there is the truth that 95% of people spend their entire lives avoiding. Nee understood something that separated his spiritual experience from most conventional religious teachings. God does not communicate with the human spirit through words. Words are instruments of intellect, tools of rational thought. But the divine spirit operates at an entirely different frequency, at a type of communication that has no language, that has no form, that is almost impossible to translate into words without losing its essence. That is why the greatest mystics from all spiritual traditions emphasize silence as the door to this deeper communion. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the presence of a communication so profound that it transcends the limitations of speech. During his years of imprisonment, Nee experienced manifestations of the Spirit that could not be verbalized, that do not fit into any coherent theological doctrine. He felt a presence that accompanied him, that consoled him, that instructed him in ways that were not rational but absolutely real. And when he tried to translate these experiences into words for his fellow prisoners, he perceived how words always fell short, always distorted, always captured only a pale fraction of what he had truly experienced. It is like trying to describe the color red to someone born blind. Words can only point in the direction, but never arrive at the point itself. This explains why most institutionalized religions become so superficial and spiritually ineffective. They transform the experience of the Spirit into concepts, into doctrines, into words that can be disputed and debated. But the Spirit is prior to words, prior to concepts. Watchman Nee realized that all those years in which he preached, in which he delivered brilliant sermons, in which he debated theology with intellectual precision, there was an essential dimension he was missing. True spirituality is not a knowledge you can accumulate, it is an experience you must allow, a surrender you must make. Silence is where this communication happens, because in the absence of language and discursive thought, the soul becomes free to receive what lies beyond the mind. Nee describes it like vibrations, like a quality of presence, like a certainty that requires no argument. It is as if the Spirit had a way of speaking that did not require sounds, that did not even require the formation of concepts in the conscious mind. Knowledge simply arrived, a certainty that overflowed in the soul, like water finding its own truth. This is an experience that cannot be explained to those who have never lived it, but it is absolutely transformative for those who experience it, even briefly. Nee finally understood that all Western religious education had prepared him to hear God in the wrong way. He had expected a voice, clear words, instructions that could be recorded and studied. But what he discovered was that God reveals himself through a silent presence that transforms being in a way far deeper than any words could do. That is why so many religious people remain empty despite all their doctrine, because they never learned to silence themselves enough to listen. That is why 95% of people ignore this secret, because it requires exactly the opposite of everything modern culture teaches them to do. When you remain in genuine silence long enough, something within you begins to die, not in a traumatic way, but gradually and inevitably. Watchman Nee observed in himself that the fears which once seemed so vast began to shrink. The ambitions that motivated him seemed to begin to dismantle. The desires that drove him lose their coercive power. There is a slow death of the small self, that version of yourself that is constantly struggling for approval, for significance, for security. And as that death happens, something radically different emerges, a quality of being that needs nothing external to validate or sustain itself. Nee began to notice that this transformation was irreversible. Even if circumstances changed, even if freedom came, he could never return to being who he was before. Because once you truly experience this quality of being that exists beyond the small self, you cannot genuinely wish for it again. It is like having tasted pure water after years of drinking something bitter. You cannot simply pretend there is no difference. The presence he touched in silence left a mark on the soul that could not be erased. That presence became more real to him than the cell itself, more real than the external limitations that surrounded him. The few writings that emerged from Nee's imprisonment revealed something extraordinary. They were not filled with bitterness, not filled with complaints about injustice, not filled with theological arguments defending his positions. Instead, they carried a quality that is almost impossible to describe, a profound peace, an unusual clarity, a depth that could only come from someone who had descended into silence and emerged transformed. There was something in the quality of his words, in the simplicity of his expressions, that revealed a man who had touched something far deeper than intellectual understanding. This transformation is not simple to sustain in the modern world, which is constantly trying to destroy it. Technology, culture, relationships, everything is designed to distance you from silence, to keep you engaged, stimulated, reactive. But Nee understood that if you touch that presence once, truly, you will have something that no technology, no distraction, no social pressure can really steal. It is a treasure hidden in the field of silence, and once you know it exists, you will never truly forget it. Even in a prison cell, even facing death, this treasure remained untouchable, unshakable, eternal. Watchman Nee realized that this transformation was the true purpose of spiritual life, not to become better, not to be more spiritual in the conventional sense, but to be radically transformed from within, in your very essence. And this type of transformation simply cannot happen while you are filling every moment with noise, with thought, with reactivity. It requires you to be willing to descend into silence and to remain there long enough for something far deeper than your conscious mind to do its transformative work within you. Nee remained in that silence until his final breath in 1972, never leaving that prison, but paradoxically freer than most people who walk the streets. You must be wondering why you are hearing all this now, at a specific moment in your life, about a man who died in a prison cell over 50 years ago. Perhaps it is coincidence. Or perhaps your soul is already feeling that silent unease that signals something in your life is not aligned with what truly matters. Perhaps you have already felt that emptiness that no amount of achievement, validation, or success can adequately fill. Perhaps you have already noticed that you are running on an endless treadmill, performing activities that seem important while the inner voice screams that something is profoundly out of place. If you are feeling this, then you have already begun, because unease is often the first sign that your soul is calling you back to what you really are. Watchman Nee left us with an extraordinary gift through his experience in that cell. He showed us that liberation does not come from the external world, does not come from favorable circumstances, does not come from success or power or freedom in the way the world understands it. He never walked out of that prison. He died there alone, separated from everything and everyone he loved. And yet, the testimony of his final years reveals a man who had found something that no imprisonment could touch, no suffering could destroy, no death could take away. True liberation, the liberation that actually matters, comes from within, from silence, from the voluntary death of the defensive self and the emergence of what lies beyond it. What Nee discovered is that most people are living in a prison far larger and far more invisible than any cell could be. They are imprisoned in the prison of their own thoughts, their own fears, their own neurotic needs for validation and significance. They are trapped in chains that they themselves created and reinforce every moment through their attention and reactivity. And the extraordinary tragedy is that the key to this invisible prison is in your hands all along. The key is silence. It is the willingness to stop, to give up the struggle, to allow what is real and eternal within you finally to have space to emerge and manifest. Nee found that key in the worst possible circumstances, which means it is available to you in whatever circumstances you find yourself right now. The question you must ask yourself now is simple, but radically important. Are you willing to have silence? Are you willing to bear the discomfort it will bring initially? Because yes, it will be uncomfortable at first. Your mind will struggle, your habitual desires will scream, your fears will try to drag you back into noise. But if you can remain just a little bit longer in silence, as Watchman Nee did until his last breath, something will begin to change. A presence will begin to make itself known. A quality of being will begin to emerge that is far more real, far more valuable, far more liberating than anything you can achieve in the external world. This is what Nee discovered in prison, and this is what you are being invited to discover now as well. Most people will continue to ignore this calling. They will continue filling their silence with noise, their empty nights with glowing screens, their empty moments with worries and plans. But you who have listened this far, you already have the opportunity. Those 95% of people who ignore this key, they simply do not know. But you know, and now that you know, the question becomes inevitable. What will you do with this knowledge? Will you let it fade like every other piece of information that passes through your awareness? Or will you dare to step into the silence, to face what it reveals, to allow the transformation that Nee discovered to begin working within you? The choice, as it always has been, is entirely yours. So, how do you actually enter this silence that Watchman Nee discovered in his darkest hour? It begins not with effort, but with surrender. Start by carving out just 10 minutes each day where you remove yourself from every external voice. No phone, no music, no conversation, no input of any kind. Sit in a space where you will not be interrupted, and when the noise in your mind begins to scream for attention, do not fight it. Simply observe it like you would watch clouds passing across the sky. Nee understood that the mind will resist violently at first because silence threatens every false identity you have built. But if you remain present, if you refuse to fill that space with distraction, something beneath the noise will begin to emerge. When external voices try to pull you back, the opinions of others, the demands of the world, the endless notifications, recognize them for what they are. Invitations to abandon yourself. The practice is not to become perfect at silence, but to return to it again and again, like returning home after being lost in foreign lands. The secret Watchman Nee carried to his grave was not complicated, but it demands everything. It demands that you stop running from yourself. It demands that you face the terror of your own company. It demands that you release the desperate need to be seen, validated, and approved by a world that does not even know who you truly are. In that release, in that descent into silence, you will discover what Nee discovered, a presence that has been waiting for you beneath all the noise, beneath all the striving, beneath all the fear. That presence is not something you achieve, it is something you uncover by removing everything that obscures it. And once you taste it, even once, you will understand why Nee could remain at peace in a prison cell while so many people remain anxious in their freedom. Now I want to hear from you, because this is not just information to consume and forget. What is the one voice, internal or external, that keeps you from entering silence? What fear, what obligation, what distraction has the strongest grip on your attention right now? Write it in the comments below, because naming it is the first step to freeing yourself from it. And if this message reached something real inside you, if you felt even a flicker of recognition, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel if you are ready to go deeper into truths that the world ignores but your soul desperately needs. Watchman Nee spent 20 years in prison discovering what 95% of people will never find in a lifetime of freedom. The question is, Will you be part of the 5% who dares to enter the silence and discover what is waiting there?